A company comes and they're like, we have policies, we know what we need to do. And then we get in there and they don't.
Hello. It's Jacob Hill with GRC Academy. Today I'm here with Miss Cera Adams. Cera, how are you today?
I'm very good, thank you.
Good. Thank you so much for coming on. And folks, if you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to like, comment, share, subscribe, review, all of those great things. Helps me out. Thank you so much in advance. Well, Cera, tell us about yourself. How did you get to where you are today?
Well, I started in the financial industry. I worked there for about 10 years in risk management, information security, compliance, audit, and from there went into more IT audit in the healthcare world. Did a few years there, and now I'm at OCD Tech, Director of Assurance Services.
Well, we're here to talk about SOC, so very interested to learn more about it myself. Tell us about how it started.
It started years ago, formerly known as the SAS 70. This was more so geared towards the review over data centers. And it was very specific to that. And then to broaden the scope of it, the AI CPA retired it and came up with the SSAE 16, another acronym that had a few versions, 16, 18, I think 20. And that morphed into the SOC 2, or the SOC reports. So the system and organization controls. Yeah, reports.
I don't know that I've ever heard of the SSAE 16. Definitely heard of SOC 2.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. Okay. Who manages SOC?
SOC reports are managed by the AI CPA, so American Institute of Certified Professional Accountants. And they govern it, and they created the criteria. They are the only ones that can sign off on a report. They usually work with IT auditors to help create the report and do all the work and research and testing.
I think I've seen in the past looking at different firms that do SOC, and a lot of times they're CPA firms. Is that right?
Yes. So the CPA firm must have qualified IT professionals to do the SOC reports. And then the report, the final product, is signed off by a CPA.
Well, would you say that SOC is it a framework, or is it actually just more of an assessment?
I would say it's an assessment over a security framework. There's the criteria that they give you, and there's a couple different areas that they focus on. And we basically go in and look over all the security from governance to change management, incident management, logical access, all the good security areas.
Talk to us about some of the recent changes. I understand was it 2022 there was a change?
Yep. So they've changed a few times over the last few years, but most recently, 2022, they basically updated the guidance for meeting their criteria. And some of those include around physical assets. So managing those, knowing where they are, recovering them when people leave, as well as not only having like a network diagram, but also having like a data flow diagram. So knowing what your data is, what types of data you have, where it's stored, where it's coming and going from in your systems and throughout the environment, internally, externally.
What kind of companies would go for a SOC assessment?
Anyone that's a service organization. So it could be a SaaS company, it could be an MSP, it could be some platform, some software, a service, anyone that is receiving and sharing data or storing data of their customers, maybe, just to give those customers kind of peace of mind about the security of their information.
Talk to us about scoping, because I was recently involved with ISO 27001. We did an assessment, and that was interesting for me because in the NIST 800-171 world, the scope is real simple. It's where's the CUI?
Yes.
But in the ISO world, it was up to us what we wanted to put in scope and what was out of scope. Is it the same with the SOC?
It's more similar to the ISO. I would say what's in scope is really what they call your system. So that could be your service, your software, your product. And we define that up front. If you have a whole bunch of cloud services, we may only put 3 of them in scope and just look at the processes around those, or we could put all of them that you have.
And probably the reason why they don't put everything in scope is, I guess, would be cost and certain things.
The reasons why it may not be in scope are it's not mature enough. Maybe it's not following all the processes yet. So, if there's one outlier that is still kind of a manual process and not going through the automated flows of monitoring or changes or access or something, we don't want to put it in there if it's not ready to be looked at yet. So sometimes people hold back a year and then we look at it the next year.
I do know that SOC has a few different levels. Talk to us about SOC 1.
So SOC 1 is only over the financial controls of the financial systems for financial reporting. So although there are IT systems there, it's also looking at the data that comes from those systems. So that's much more financial and less IT. So if you're going to do a SOC 1, your requirements would probably be, you'd first, discover what's in scope, what your financial systems are, what impacts your financial statements. And then the requirements are how accurate they report, how secure are they, and the usual security controls over those.
Do you choose the security controls that you apply, or is it a set standard in SOC?
So the SOC 2 or SOC, all of the SOCs, they are just criteria. So in working with companies, we have to come up with their actual control framework. They don't give you the controls you need to meet. They give you more high-level criteria.
Okay, so it's like objectives. And then do you select security controls from maybe other frameworks so you don't have to come up with it on your own?
We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. So if they already have logical access controls in place, we will try and use them where we can. But the SOC 2 does have some kind of unique areas in governance, risk management, and things like that would have more specific SOC 2 controls.
So when someone is on a company's website and they see, okay, we are SOC 1 compliant, what does that actually mean to the end user?
I think that they've been independently assessed over their financial reporting controls and whether or not they did well and passed.
Okay, all right. And there's no certification associated, right? If a company says they're SOC compliant, could that also mean that they were assessed, but is there a threshold to pass or fail?
It is a little bit subjective, but if you're not meeting any of the criteria, you're not going to get a report. And I mean, it is managed by the AICPA, and the AICPA does get audited on these every few years. They get what's called a peer review, and they'll pick these reports and they will look at them and see that they followed the process and see that the correct steps were taken. So if we give them a report and it's not accurate or done well, I think it's in the best interest of everybody to kind of put out the right information out there. That's why the CPAs kind of QA it and review it before they sign off.
You mentioned that if someone is just completely failing, they would not get a report. So is the report almost like some sort of certificate, or what would you say?
I would say it's an assessment. It's not a certificate at all. It is a report, and it does states it's from the AICPA. It is signed by a CPA firm, but I wouldn't say here's your certificate. It's not run that way.
Well, let's dive into SOC 2 then. Tell us about the purpose of SOC 2.
SOC 2 is more to look at your security or confidentiality, availability, processing integrity, or privacy over your system that's in scope. So the client will say, here's what we want to review. Out of those options, security is always included. So we look at that one for sure. And then we look at all of the controls they've established to meet them.
Hey everyone, Jacob here. Let me tell you about today's sponsor, Vanta. As the number and severity of third-party breaches continues to rise, companies are increasingly vigilant, not just about how they handle their own data, but how their vendors do as well. For security and compliance leaders, this means more security reviews are coming across your desk every day, and valuable time is being wasted on manual security reviews. With Vanta questionnaire automation, security and compliance teams can complete security
security reviews up to 5 times faster, giving you time back to focus on running your security and compliance programs. Over 8,000 global companies like ZoomInfo, Smart Recruiters, and Noibu use Vanta to save time on security reviews. Visit vanta.com/GRC Academy to learn more about questionnaire automation. That's vanta.com/GRC Academy. Thanks and enjoy the rest of the episode.
All right. So how does a SOC 2 assessment work? Previously, you mentioned that there are more set security controls for SOC 2. What does that look like?
So we will meet with them, and for each criteria, say it's a logical access criteria, understand what they do for access controls, reviewing, adding, removing access, MFA, change management, system development, and all that. We go through and we figure out what their controls are, and depending on what kind of assessment we're doing, we'll test them to see if they're working and give an opinion.
Is that an identification of the applicable controls, would you say?
Well, yeah, the ones that meet the criteria, that's the whole point, is we're trying to take one criteria, figure out what the organization does to meet it, and basically map them together.
Can you walk us through maybe an example of what the criteria look like, and then how you would map that back to a control?
Like the first criteria has to do with the company working with integrity and ethical values. And you might say, what does that mean? And that's typically things like, do they have a code of conduct? Do they do performance reviews to let people see how people are working? So those are kind of typical things. Companies usually have some sort of handbook or code of conduct that everybody has to acknowledge or sign. And we say those are their controls. We could go test that everybody has signed one of those, as well as performance reviews. We would look at our bunch of employees and say, did they have one in the past year?
There's a mention of categories that you would choose: security, availability, confidentiality, processing integrity, and privacy. That's interesting to me because it's actually categories that you choose to go after. So talk through that.
If organization's going to choose what they want, sometimes it's based on what they think is important to them. Sometimes their customers are saying, hey, we want you to go get a SOC 2 and it must have availability in it. So when we are preparing for the actual audit, we will go over what they all mean: security, over the systems or information; privacy, over personal information. You must, that's a big, huge one. So anyone doing privacy must have a pretty strong privacy program. Availability would be more like just how are your systems and working and available as intended. Confidentiality, whatever your controls are over what you just deem as confidential information. Processing integrity, transactions, are they accurate and reliable? Things like that. So depending on your business would depend on which one you choose. Security's pretty much always in there, or is always in there.
What is a restricted report?
So the SOC 2 is a restricted report for intended users. So it's not something you would just take and put on your website. You would probably give it to your customers that are requesting it, somebody that you have agreements with, because it might have information in it that you don't want to share publicly.
Yeah, and I've seen that in the past. They always say, "Well, in our SOC 2 report, it's available," and maybe you have to sign an NDA or something like that.
Request it.
Yeah, I've seen that before. Also, I've heard the term type 1 and type 2. What are the differences?
Yep. So a type 1 will be in a point of time. So we really just look at the design of the controls. How do they meet the criteria? We don't really test. It's more policies and procedures and looking that they have a process in place to meet each control. And it's sort of the first step into working into a type 2. So you're new to this and you don't really have your policies in place. So you get that already. We do our testing. We see that your policies say you do your controls. And then that's it. It's in a point of time. We say, looks good. And that's what's on the report. So it's a little bit shorter. It's a little easier. And that's your opportunity to then go implement all those controls and make sure that they're continuously happening.
From an end user perspective, again, we go to a SaaS provider. They say, we're SOC 2, type 2. What does that mean to the end user?
So that's the next step after a type 1. where we actually go over a period of time, typically 6 or 12 months, and we look at that whole year or that 6 months, and we test over time. So controls around terminations or change management or system development, we will look at a whole population of those and just choose from, take a sample out of that whole population of the year and test that the process was followed for each one. So there's a lot more chances there that things could go wrong, but usually they don't. Usually people are following the rules and documenting everything they're supposed to.
I'm thinking about from a NIST perspective, because, we have annual security reviews and they're trying to go towards continuous monitoring, but that's kind of fascinating the way the SOC 2 Type 2 approaches it, because it sounds like you define a set period and then you evaluate the same requirement or the same control over a period of time to make sure. And it's the third party assessor doing it every time, right?
I would say we're not going to look that you still have a access policy in January and December, but we'll look that your controls that happen on weekly, monthly, as needed basis are happening.
Okay.
Or
Okay.
annual.
Cool. Let's dive into SOC 3 then. What is that for?
SOC 3. So you've got your SOC 2, Type 2, and now you do want to use it for marketing a little bit, saying, hey, we do have this great report. We have been assessed and we do have these great controls. So this one's a little bit more for public use. It just gives the high level results, the high level information. It doesn't include everything about your system. And that one can be more publicly used, maybe put on your website or handed, given out a little more freely.
I haven't seen that around very much. Is that maybe becoming more of a common thing, or is it something that they would have to buy separately in addition to the SOC 2 report?
It would go hand in hand with the SOC 2. It's not as common. We do have some people that request them because they want to use them for marketing purposes.
Really, the SOC 3 is the publicly releasable version of a SOC 2, I suppose.
Yeah, it has limited information and it's not as detailed.
Talk to us about some of the strengths and weaknesses of a SOC 2.
Well, I think what's different about a SOC 2 is that it's a little more personalized to your company because you do have to come up with the controls and your processes, and it's very custom to you. Though everybody should have all these controls, it does kind of let you use that detail of whatever your processes are compared to ISO 27001 or 2, say, that gives you the controls and says, here's what you have to meet. And although you may meet them different ways, to at least lets you show off whatever your system strengths are.
And that's very interesting. I think that having the SOC 3 report, as something that marketing can show off is something rather unique, I think. Definitely not in the ISO 27001 world. That's not there.
No.
The NIST world doesn't have that. So that's kind of unique. If a company wants to go after, let's say, SOC 2, where should they start? What should that beginning journey look like for them?
I would say identifying your policies and procedures, documenting what you do, because that's where we're going to start. We're going to look at all those policies and procedures and see that they match your day-to-day processes. I would say documenting your governance. So if you have a board or a leadership team, and a lot of times we run into, well, they meet all the time, but I don't know that unless you document it. So maybe taking the meeting notes and checking agendas and keeping track of the invites, because we're going to ask for all that. Also, risk assessments, annual risk assessments around security are definitely part of the SOC 2. And although I think, again, people do this naturally in meetings all the time, I think having a formal process around it is going to be important because we're going to ask about it.
Well, from a technical perspective, what do you think would be a good recommendation for folks to look at? Maybe security frameworks or things like that. If they don't know what to do, what is existing out there that they could get started with and help them ultimately getting to that assessment and then the report?
Well, first, I think they could just look up general computer controls. That's going to cover all your logical access and change management, incident management, risk management, vendor management.
How much leeway, I suppose, do you have as the auditor to kind of coach the client and tell them how to address security controls?
So before the audit, we have lots of leeway. I can give as much guidance as I want. I don't actually do any hands-on work, but I can find gaps, I can give advice, I can find missing policies and tell them what's missing. After the audit starts, there's not too much leeway. Once we've agreed to what the controls are, if all of a sudden, we thought you were doing something monthly and you're actually doing it annually, that's not great.
Different frameworks, they approach independence a bit differently. So is the same company allowed to provide consulting and then assessing? Do they have to be a different person doing the consulting versus assessing, or how does that work?
They do actually allow us to do readiness work where we go in, we assess, what they have in place, what they don't, do some gap analysis, advise them a little bit on what they could do to meet the controls, help them with their controls, help them identify evidence, like what kind of evidence would meet each control. And then, yes, we are allowed to still do the audit afterwards.
So if someone was going for a SOC 2, they could just work with one company to help with the gap assessment, with meeting the requirements, and then finally to the assessment.
It's actually helpful because we get to know the company and get to kind of understand, what their environment looks like, what systems they use. And then when we get to the audit, we can kind of talk to it a little easier.
Now, let's talk about some of war stories, things you've seen over your time and your career, just things that stick out in your mind. Talk to us about that.
Oh, there's nothing too crazy. I mean, nobody's died. But I would say the worst thing that can happen is if you're not prepared. So, a company comes and they're like, we have policies, we know what we need to do, we've read the criteria, we're all set, we do all these things. And then we get in there and they don't. They're definitely not consistently. They forgot about a system they use. They have no vendor management process. They, don't write much down. And either we can stop the audit and say, let's get out of here before, we both have a bad ending here, or we give them a report that has a bad opinion on it, a not favorable opinion. And they can use that still if their clients are asking and say, hey, here are the places where we didn't do well, but we're doing it again and we're fixing everything, which has happened to us. But yeah, that's kind of, I think, the worst case scenario is kind of going in this, being a little overconfident and then not doing too great.
This has been really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. I really appreciate it. Where can people find you?
We're at OCD Tech, ocdtech.com with Cera Adams. We'd be happy to help anyone with assurance services, advisory services.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, folks. Hope you enjoyed that. If you want to see more, be sure to subscribe and then check out this video.